Hello, BookTube. Well, it's day 2 of NonFiction November, which is an event hosted by Gemma at NonFic Books and Olive at A Book Olive, in which for the month of November they encourage you to read more nonfiction. Uh, they set up 4 broad challenges that you can meet or not meet as you please, with the goal being for you to read some nonfiction if you read none, or more if you read some, for you to try it. Try and increase your nonfiction and try and see the enjoyment that you can get out of it. It really is incredibly enjoyable. It's just on the surface a little intimidating, and sometimes. And the one of the purposes of Nonfiction November is to sort of take away some of that intimidation, to make nonfiction seem more accessible. And I very much want to keep doing that myself, because the more people who read nonfiction, the more people will enjoy it, I think. I think it's, on a preachy level, I think it's disgraceful how little nonfiction people read, even in very literate countries. So an event like Nonfiction November is only to the good. And yesterday, for Nonfiction November, I talked about an ancient historian, basically one of the earliest proponents of nonfiction, for whom we have a book and a record, the ancient historian Herodotus. And I got a lot of emails after I made that video that unbeknownst to me, I had actually picked an author who is intimidating. I had only picked him because for me he's an old friend, and someone I very much wanted to praise as an enjoyable experience that goes way back. And so when I was thinking about the author that I wanted to talk about today, just briefly, I realized that the same thing could be said of him, probably in spades. He also is an intimidating author on the surface. I'm referring to the Roman historian Livy, who was born in Gaul, in a province away from the city of Rome, sometime in the middle of the first century BC. So Rome was in turmoil, and the civil wars ramping the country from end to end, and no one was immune from that. No matter who you were, you had to pick a side or get caught up in it anyway. Massive amounts of land changed hands, massive amounts of patrimonies were lost and gained, in those were horrible years. And somehow, young man Livy, I have a picture here. There he is with his favorite dog. Somehow, young man Livy managed to hold on to enough money to go to Rome, get a first-class education, and write for a living, as opposed to working. He was never a soldier. He was never a senator. He never engaged in public life. He wrote for his whole life, and for his whole life in Rome, mostly in Rome. I mean, he vacationed and summered like everybody else, but mostly he wrote one book, one enormous work, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, that was meant to go to give a history of Rome from Romulus and Remus all the way up to the Emperor Augustus, who Livy knew and who said that he liked him. Now, Augustus never read anything, but like most politic leaders, he found it expedient to say that he liked Livy's work, especially since Livy was writing exactly what he wanted. He had gained power, soul power. He had won the civil wars, and what he needed was unifying, binding civil mythology. And he went everywhere for it. He went to the Roman poet Horace. He went to the poet Virgil for a national epic, the Aeneid. And he went to Livy as well he didn't have to actually ask these people. He didn't have to make them an offer they couldn't refuse, although Augustus was the prototypical Godfather-style gangster. He didn't have to do that. That's where the market was. That's what the ethos was. And Livy embraced it wholeheartedly. Unlike Herodotus, at the beginning of his history, tells us that he's recording these events because they were really important, because they are as important in their own way as, for instance, the great events of mythology, the Trojan War, for instance. Livy tells us at the beginning of his history something a little different. He also thinks these events are very important, but he comes right out and says that he values them for their moral freight as well as for the facts. He In the course of his long, we have a lot of Aber Bekondada left. We have a lot of his histories left. He's a well-represented ancient author. It's a crying shame that some of them are not. We have references to, for instance, Livy's quasi mentor and nemesis, Asinius Pollio, wrote for his whole life. We have references to a vast corpus of work that he wrote, and we have lines and pieces here and there, and nothing of it survives. Same thing with Pliny the Younger, an officious arslicker under the Emperor Trajan, whose uncle, Pliny the Elder, wrote all the time. Just for a whole busy, inquisitive life, he wrote all the time. We have scarcely a fraction of it. Livy's not like that. We don't have the whole of his book, but we have a lot of it. And he starts it off in that way, with an explicitly moralistic tone, that I'm not just recounting the events of the past, I'm recounting the worthy events, the things that make us Roman, the things that make us worthwhile, the things that make our nation great. He makes a show at various points in the book of weighing and measuring his sources, but he's not very good at it. He's even worse at it than Herodotus is, and that's saying something. So even when he's writing about things later on in the history, when he's writing about things about which he could have interviewed eyewitness survivors, battles and civil unrest in Rome, where he could have talked to people who were actually involved, and could have gone to the archives on the Capitoline and read the digest of that time, the closest thing you could get to a newspaper. Even when he could have done that, he very seldom does. He has a story that he wants to tell, and he kind of knows what it is. He doesn't usually stray very far from very well-known facts, but you can't read Livy for history. You have to read him for something else, something that's largely missing from the present day or maligned. When you think of a historian, a quote-unquote historian these days, who has a moral story to tell and isn't really concerned with the facts, you think of Bill O'Reilly and his ghostwriters. You think of Glenn Beck. You think of people that you very rightly mock as pseudo-intellectual charlatans. The kind of writing that Livy did has disappeared, where you're telling conscientious history, but you're also conscientiously warping it. And the end product is respectable. That whole thing together, that kind of history is largely gone. It breathed its last in the 19th century, and we will see no more of it in legitimate circles. In Livy's own day, he would have been called a historian. But the thing that I want to recommend in his books, I wish that there were, from Norton maybe, or a Penguin Classic Deluxe edition, I wish there were an enormous single volume of Livy that had his whole book and an introduction and notes. I wish, in a bound version, I wish that existed, but it doesn't. Instead, what publishers always do, Oxford and Penguin, always break up his books along sort of kind of thematic lines. So in Penguin, for instance, there's a volume on the very earliest myths and history of Rome. So you get Romulus and Remus, you get the kings, the Tarquins, and the expulsion of the kings. Stuff that almost certainly didn't happen, but it was part of Rome's historical folklore, and Livy tells the hell out of it. And then you have, Italian history, the Italian civil wars that were fought, that left Rome standing as victor. And you have Rome's wars with the powers of the Mediterranean as Rome expands and fights other powers. And as the glory of those Penguin volumes, and Oxford does the same thing, there's really no way to avoid this particular grouping. There's always one book that is Livy's narration of the Second Punic War. Rome fought a series of 3 wars with its great rival, Carthage, for control of the world, of the Western world, basically. And the First Punic War was a bit of a mess, strung out, no real good narrative lines to attract somebody like Livy. And the Third Punic War was a farce. But the Second Punic War was an epic struggle, a fantastic story, a world war that is famous for Hannibal, but it has drama in every one of its theaters for every year that it went on. And Livy, the books of his that cover the Second Punic War are fantastic reading. They really are. I am encouraging you for a nonfiction November, maybe if you're interested, to find a volume, the Livy volume that covers the Second Punic War. The Oxford version, I think it's called Hannibal's War. The Penguin Classic version, it's the War with Hannibal. And it's, give it a try. Read the introduction. Read, Wikipedia or Roman.org on Livy. Give yourself a little grounding, or a lot of grounding, until you're comfortable. And then sink into what a friend of mine referred to as the warm bath of Livy's storytelling. Because once you let go of, did this really happen? And, a good annotated edition will tell you in the footnotes where Livy is stretching the blanket and where he's just wrong. Once you get away from, did this really happen? And you start to just listen to the role of his prose, which you will really like it. He's really enjoyable company to read. He's traveled with me all over the world. The precise magic of what he does with his Latin, no one has ever translated. It would almost be impossible to do. And I hate saying that about translation. I always think translators are a little wimpy when they say something like that. But there's a thing. You take my word for it if you don't have Latin. There's a thing that Latin does with its word order that cannot really be duplicated in English. Certainly not for more than a couple of paragraphs. You'd go cross-eyed. And not only does it do that, but its best practitioners could wield that like a precision instrument and make it absolutely beautiful and surprising, and in a way that you can't really do with English prose. So the best English translations of Livy, the Robin Waterfield for Oxford and Aubrey de Selincourt for Penguin, are the ones that try to do the equivalent of that in English, what English can do that's kind of a version of that, to show the rhetorical virtuosity that is Livy's strongest suit. So I guess my point here is that the English language translations that you will encounter are worthy. I don't recall an English language translation of Livy in the last 100 years that's bad. So if you go to a library, you can't go wrong. And one that I would suggest you avoid is the multi-volume red-spined Loeb Classical Library, because there's no art in the English translation there. If you have the Latin, absolutely, there's your authoritative text. But if you don't, I would suggest just getting a paperback if you're interested in this. And not for Roman history. This is not what you read if you want to read Roman history. What this is instead is even in a way more interesting. It's what Romans thought of their history, what they wanted it to be. So in addition to being grand storytelling from start to finish, it's also a nonstop psychology experiment. It's utterly fascinating if it appeals to you. So I thought for my nonfiction November recommendation today, it would be my old friend Livy. And I'll be back with yet more tedious recommendations tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.